From 1346 to 1353, a horrific plague devastated Europe. The bubonic plague spread from China to Europe through trade routes. Infected fleas and rats played a huge role in spreading the disease. Over 60% of Europe's population died out, causing labor shortages and decreases in wages. Many saw the Black Death as God punishing man for his sins. In the 11th century, European Christians fought a series of holy wars to check the spread of Islam and to retake former Christian territories. Knights were promised indulgences if they fought to spread Christianity and stop Muslim expansion. The Crusades ended in the 16th century because of the Protestant Reformation. Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy in the 14th century. This work describes heaven, hell, and purgatory. Dante is guided through the icy layer of hell by Virgil, a pagan who's not allowed to enter heaven. The Inferno is considered the intermezzo or bridge to the Renaissance because Dante took accepted ideas about hell and completely overturned them. He also returned to antiquity through Virgil and put man on the same plane as God. Humanism is the glorification of man and human beings. Instead of God, humanists believed in the greatness of mankind and said that through studying the liberal arts, man could set himself free and improve society. Petrarch is considered the father of humanism because he went back to ancient Greek and Latin texts from the time before Jesus' influence, meaning no religious influence. Humanism greatly influenced art from the Renaissance, which the Medici family heavily funded. Let's look at a couple of famous artists from this era.
These are the stars of the Renaissance. These are the ones that you know. We're talking about Leonardo da Vinci, the painter of the Mona Lisa, the painter of The Last Supper, and the source of a few Dan Brown novels. But trust me, there's nothing to it. Let's move on. Number 2, Michelangelo. All right, Michelangelo, most known for painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and less known for the back wall of the Sistine Chapel, but also known for his depiction of David, a little bit different than Donatello's, and his creation of, or design of St. Peter's Basilica, the home of the Vatican. This guy was all over the place and he was good at everything.
It was said that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, which basically means his ideas about the church influenced Martin Luther. In his philosophy of Christ, Erasmus emphasized inner piety and the simplistic practices of Christ. He said people lost sight of real Christian values because they focused too much on relics, indulgences, and veneration of saints. He also said the clergy was corrupt and overindulgent. He criticized pluralism, which refers to how the clergy could have more than one job and would do their tasks poorly. Martin Luther was a devout monk who couldn't feel saved no matter how much he confessed. He realized that most deeds, such as pilgrimages, indulgences, and collecting relics, are done out of self-interest instead of inner piety. He realized faith alone was the only means of salvation. On October 31st, All Saints' Day, he nailed his 95 Theses to the Roman Catholic Church. His theses criticized the Pope's authority and pointed out corruption within the Church. His move was revolutionary, and Pope Leo X said he must have been drunk to do so. Protestant ideas led to violence. Thousands of French Protestants, or Huguenots, were killed on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572. It was believed that Catherine de' Medici forced her son Charles IX to assassinate Huguenots in Paris. However, the assassinations turned into a mob-like massacre. Afterward, Henry of Navarre signed the Edict of Nantes, which established France as a Catholic nation but allowed for religious freedom.
Catherine of Aragon was one. She failed to give me a son. I had to ask her for a divorce. That broke up her heart, of course. Young Anne Boleyn, she was 2. Had a daughter, the best she could do. I said she flirted with some other man, and off with the chop went dear Anne. Lovely Jane Seymour was 3, the love of a lifetime for me. She gave me a son, little Prince Ed. Then poor old Jane went and dropped dead. Divorced, beheaded and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne of Cleves came at 4. I fell for the portrait I saw. Then laid eyes on her face and cried, she's a horse. I must have another divorce. Catherine Howard was 5. A child of 19, so alive. She flirted with others, no way to behave. The axe sent young Kath to her grave. Catherine Parr, she was lost. By then all my best days were past. I lay on my deathbed, aged just 55. Lucky Catherine, the last, stayed alive.
Queen Elizabeth was an Anglican monarch and was the illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Historians agree that her reign kicked off the English Reformation. Here are some cool things Liz did. She killed Mary, Queen of Scots, after finding out she was going to take her place. When the Spanish Armada came to attack England, she put on armor and gave her men a rousing speech that led them to victory. When Parliament urged her to marry, she told them to shut up, basically. Other than that, her relationship with Parliament was very strong and amiable. It was called balanced polity. The age of absolutism was the age of Louis XIV. As he said, "I am the state." Louis called himself the Sun King because everything revolved around him. He built the Palace of Versailles in order to show up France's greatness to the world. The palace housed him, his nobles, and was also his court all in one place. Louis canceled the Edict of Nantes by passing the Edict of Fontainebleau, mandating that France was a Catholic nation. He wanted to break down the power of the nobles, so he gave them demeaning tasks, like putting on his shirt for him. Unfortunately, Louis bankrupted France because of his extravagance and tendency to start wars that he couldn't finish. Louis and his financial advisor Jean-Baptiste Colbert left a powerful legacy in fashion. The king created seasonal fashion and brought textile and architectural industries to France. Thanks to Louis, heels became a staple in fashion and France became the fashion center of the world, replacing Spain. Peter the Great, son of Ivan the Terrible, was another absolute monarch. His main goal as Tsar was to industrialize and westernize Russia. He did this by traveling to England, the first Tsar to leave Russia, and learning how to build ships. He's responsible for building Russia's first navy. After seeing Versailles, he got the Swedish prisoners of war to build Peterhof, which would be his window to the west. He desperately wanted Russia to catch up to the rest of the world, so he cut men's beards and coats to make them look more westernized. Thomas Hobbes believed in absolutism because kings created consistency. He said man in nature was brutish, solitary, and unable to live in peace. He modeled his social contract after English contract law. It stated that people agree to give up their natural rights to a king, so that he may rule them properly. Since he felt that religion caused civil war, he advocated that one branch of government be dedicated to religion.
Locke's political philosophy stemmed from his central belief that humanity was innately good and industrious. He believed that if given the proper tools and power, humans would form a society which would be good for all and improve the community's well-being. As such, societies could be trusted to decide which form of government was right and just. If a society was ruled unfairly or arbitrarily by an inept monarch, the people were justified in rebelling against the king or queen. Locke's ideas were a complete 180 in how monarchies were viewed. The king still held the power, but that power originated in society, and the monarchy only held that power by the consent of those he ruled. This important distinction became known as social contract theory, and many 18th century writers based their political philosophy on this idea. While Locke laid the foundation for a lot of 18th century political philosophy, Montesquieu's 1748 work, The Spirit of Laws, sought not only to recognize and explain the existing laws and governments of Western Europe, but also understand the very basis for law's existence. Montesquieu's abhorrence of despotism and governmental corruption caused him to create the philosophical justification for a common feature of modern Western government, the separation of powers and the checks and balances system. These were meant to keep one branch of government from getting more powerful than another. According to Kant, the Age of the Enlightenment, which lasted from roughly the late 17th century up to the beginning of the 19th century, was humanity's growth into intellectual maturity. Kant and others claimed that through scientific inquiry and an emphasis on reasoned discussion, mankind was finally able to think for itself rather than appealing to the authority of the Church, Greek philosophers, or other sources of supposedly revealed truth.
These meetings were very exclusive, and one would have to get direct invite in order to attend. People from different social classes came, providing several perspectives on current issues. Women were at the forefront of salons. They hosted them and decided who would be able to come. Women received only a third grade education, but sitting in on these conversations gave them a great education. One such example of a female host was Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin. Salons died out in the French Revolution. Peter Bale is an important figure in the Enlightenment because he applied skepticism to well-known texts and ideas. He challenged established social norms and criticized religious intolerance and dogmatism. He applied skepticism to the Bible by analyzing King David. He said David was actually a vile, evil man. His historical and critical dictionary was called the Bible of the Enlightenment because everyone read it. James Cook discovered Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia. He documented his journey in a book called Travels, where he describes the idea of a noble savage, or someone who lives in a simple life away from society. The noble savage does not cause harm, but he's simply not cultured. Europeans at this time were very ethnocentric and believed that their culture was superior to all others. On the contrary, other people experienced cultural relativism, where they tried to understand other cultures rather than simply judging them. Sir Isaac Newton was a brilliant scientist and discovered the natural laws of gravity and that the planets revolved around the sun. His discoveries proved to the world that by using reason and rationality, they too could discover natural laws within politics, society, and even economics. Newton was also an accomplished mathematician and philosopher. He began to go crazy after convincing himself that God was communicating with him through numbers in the Bible. 7. Adam Smith was a Scottish economist and philosopher who opposed mercantilism and protective tariffs. He said that a nation's wealth is not based on gold and silver, but instead on labor. Smith advocated for a laissez-faire system. He said government should only lend an invisible hand. He led the foundation for capitalism with his ideas that self-interest is beneficial to society instead of detrimental. The September massacres occurred after radicals heard that Austria and Prussia were going to invade France. They went insane. Sans-culottes invaded the jails and slaughtered everyone because they wanted to make sure that the counter-revolutionaries would not join the invading armies. They murdered, raped, disemboweled priests, and hacked nobles apart. Even Robespierre said this was going too far. The Vendée was one of the 3 cities where people did not fully support the revolutionaries. People in the Vendée rebelled, and revolutionaries slaughtered them with the guillotine. The rest of Europe was shocked by how brutal it was. Great Britain came up with propaganda to denounce the bloodthirsty revolutionaries. Robespierre, Marat, and Danton were the revolutionary leaders. Robespierre was in charge of the Committee of Public Safety, which was created to squash chaos. He basically ordered everyone to be guillotined and was instrumental in the deaths of thousands. He went too far, and the National Convention plotted to get rid of him and eventually killed him. With his death came the end of the revolution. Marat lived in a bathtub because he had a gross skin disease. He started a revolutionary newspaper called Friend of the People, which was pretty much propaganda. And Danton was a great orator who took Robespierre's ideas and conveyed them to the public. He motivated people to go to war. Nationalism allowed France to create one of the largest militaries ever seen in Europe, which was over 1 million men. Marat was killed in his bathtub. Charlotte Corday stabbed him in the bathtub and said she killed him so that France could be saved. Bye! Napoleon came to power in 1789. He quoted, "I saw the crown of France laying on the ground, so I picked it up with my sword and put it on my head." The quote basically shows how the sword symbolizes a strong military, and the crown on the floor represented a lack of strength. He was a chameleon and controlled others' perception of him. He was a great leader and saw leadership as an art form, and he rose up thanks to talent, luck, and opportunity. After all, he ditched his soldiers in Egypt, but he did find the Rosetta Stone. Napoleon and his army busted into the Directory and simply said, "We're going to install Napoleon as the new leader." Everyone just said, "Okay." Napoleon told the world a guns blazing story just to make them respect him. He installed himself as the first consul or head executive. In 1804, Napoleon installed himself as emperor. The people wanted Catholicism, and Napoleon brought it back. At his coronation, he forces the Pope to sign the Concordat of 1801, which forced the Pope to recognize the victories of the French Revolution and forced him to take back what he said. He is crowned in Notre Dame and has a choir sing in his honor. The Pope bowed to him and put the crown on his head, and the other on Josephine's, which means I'm in charge, not the Pope. However, Napoleon's mama didn't attend. Napoleon acted like a dictator, not a constitutional monarch. He got rid of 60 out of 73 newspapers and instituted a plebiscite vote to make people feel important. Before, the French had 300-plus law systems. Napoleon just condensed them into 7. His code upheld property rights, gave legal equality to men before law, upheld religious toleration, and enforced tax laws for the first time. Napoleon balanced the budget in 1802 for the first time, all because of his tax laws. He put France into a constant state of war because it boosted economy and made it easier to control people. Great Britain blockaded French ports, and Napoleon could not do a land invasion because Great Britain was too strong. His plan was to crush Britain by shutting down its economy. He told Tsar Alex I that if Russia traded with Great Britain, he would invade Russia. He also told the Americans not to trade with Great Britain. Napoleon found out that Russia was still trading with Great Britain and sent in 600,000 men. He moved his men in waves so they would not get attacked all at once. He ordered his men to live off the land, but the Russians burned everything down. The Russians lured them in and then doubled behind them and cut off Napoleon's food supply. Napoleon is forced to retreat because his men are caught in the dead of winter. He's humiliated, and the coalition exiles him to Elba. However, the soldiers love him there and they help smuggle him off the island. He sees soldiers on the island and he says, "If you're going to kill your leader, kill me now," but no one touches him. He goes back into France, rules for 100 days, but King Louis VIII, Great Britain, Austria, and Prussia were not happy about this. At Waterloo, Napoleon doesn't think Prussia would ever make it to battle, but he was wrong and they showed up with reinforcements. He loses in his exile to St. Helena in Africa. The Congress of Vienna was made up of Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. They re-established the Bourbon dynasty under Louis XVIII after Napoleon's defeat. They arranged the final peace settlement with Prince Clemens von Metternich as their leader. He was guided by the principle of legitimacy, which said that it was necessary to restore a legitimate monarch to preserve traditional institutions. Spain and France were placed under Bourbon kings. They put a Romanov dynasty in charge of Poland. The Congress wanted to create a balance of power that would prevent one country from dominating the rest, aka France. Edmund Burke said society was a contract and that the state is a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. He rejected radical revolution, but not gradual change. Joseph de Maistre was a spokesperson for counter-revolutionary and authoritarian conservatism. He embraced hereditary monarchy as divine. Only absolute monarchs could guarantee order in society and avoid chaos. Conservatives favored obedience to political authority, thought religion was necessary for social order, hated revolutions, and did not want to accept liberal demands or nationalistic aspirations. The Concert of Europe was created to maintain the new status quo against war and revolution. The Quadruple Alliance wanted to renew commitment against the Bonapartist restoration and agreed to meet periodically to maintain peace in Europe. After taking their army out of France and adding France to the concert, the Quad became the Quintuple Alliance. At Troppau, Metternich proposed a policy of intervention, which read that states under revolution cannot be part of the European alliance until the situation ceases. If revolution threatens other states, the powers of Europe have the right to send armies into revolting countries in order to restore legitimate monarchs. Great Britain refused to interfere in other international affairs, but Austria, Prussia, and Russia authorized the sending of Austrian troops to Naples. The troops restored Ferdinand I. They also authorized France to invade Spain and restore Ferdinand VII. Britain made the concert break down and kept continental powers from interfering in Latin America. Liberalism is the belief that all people should be as free from restraint as possible. Economic liberals maintained a laissez-faire mentality where government should not interrupt in free place of natural economic forces. Basically, government should not restrain the economic liberty of the individual and should restrict itself to only three functions: defense, police protection, and construction of public works. Thomas Malthus stated that a population grows quicker than food, which leads to overpopulation and mass starvation. Nature imposes a major restraint to the growth of humans. Misery and poverty are just the result of nature. David Ricardo stated that an increase in population means more workers. More workers causes wages to fail. Misery and starvation then reduce the population and the whole system reverses. He said rising wages would be pointless. This was his iron law of wages. Political liberals called for equality before the law, freedom of assembly, speech, and press, and freedom from arbitrary arrest, which were guaranteed by a written document. These were civil liberties. They also wanted religious freedom, separation of church and state, peaceful opposition to government, and representative assembly elected by voters, therefore a constitutional monarchy. Prussia formed the Zollverein in 1834, and its new constitution appeared to establish a constitutional monarchy because it called for a bicameral legislature. William I of the Hohenzollern family doubled Prussia's army and instituted 3 years of compulsory service for all men. He appointed Bismarck after the first prime minister rejected his military budget. Bismarck was a moderate. He only waged war when all other diplomatic alternatives failed. He came up with realpolitik, or ultimate realism in diplomacy. Even though Parliament rejected his appeal for army appropriations, he collected taxes and organized the army anyway. Bismarck caused several wars. In the Danish War, Prussia got land from Denmark and sought to exclude Austria in order to gain power. Prussia won in the Austro-Prussian War thanks to superior weapons, and also the Franco-Prussian War after the southern German states joined the northern ones. German unification was unity achieved by the Prussian monarchy and the Prussian army. Germany had merged into Prussia, not Prussia into Germany. Prussian leadership of German unification meant triumph of authoritarian, militaristic values over liberal constitutional sentiments and the development of the new German state. The Augsburg of 1867 was negotiated between Austria and Hungary after the Austro-Prussian War. It created a dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Each part of the empire had a constitution, bicameral legislature, government machinery for domestic affairs, and its own capital. Both countries were put under Francis Joseph, a common army, the same foreign policy, and a system of finances. Russia's defeat in the Crimean War proved that it needed more industrialization. Tsar Alexander II wanted to change the system. He freed the serfs on March 3, 1861. Peasants could marry as they chose, own property, and sue. However, peasants got crappy land, and the mir, or village commune, collected land payments that they didn't even have. He created zemstvos, or local assemblies that provided some self-government. He reformed the legal system and accepted the principle of equality before law. The People's Will were members of radical populists that assassinated Alexander II in 1881. They wanted a new society where the peasant communes could become independent, self-governing bodies that would form the basis of the new Russia. Albert Einstein pushed theories of thermodynamics. In his theory of relativity, he stated that time and space are not absolute but relative to the observer and are intuitive in a four-dimensional space-time continuum. If all material things were to disappear from the universe, time and space would also disappear, because they're not independent. He said matter is just a form of energy. E equals mc squared was his famous formula. This formula helps explain that energy is in an atom. Speed is the fastest thing on Earth. If we can move at the speed of light, we can time travel. His theories led to the atomic age. The 1920s is called the heroic age of physics because of him. Marie Curie was a French scientist who discovered that radium gave off radiation from within the atom. She found that atoms were little universes with subatomic particles behaving erratically. Understanding the process within atoms became the main focus of the new physics. Her work paved the way for X-rays, but too much exposure eventually killed her. Sigmund Freud is the father of psychoanalysis. He said people are all liars and they don't even know it. He described the unconscious, where human behavior is determined by life experiences and inner forces. In his iceberg theory, he said that the conscious is above the water, and we suppress motives underwater, where most of the ice is. He described the inner life. The id is our pleasure principle. It's primitive and it drives our unconscious. Our ego is our reasoning center. It's our coordinator of inner life that helps us live in a society. And our superego is the morality principle. We get our morals from the same-sex parent. Nietzsche said that Western society was incapable of creativity since reason and rationality replaced emotion, passion, and natural instinct. He said humans were at the mercy of irrational life forces, and said that the slave morality of Christianity crushed human will and impulse for life. He called Christianity the religion of pity because it glorified the meek, but meek people can't survive in nature. He said God is dead, and that Europeans killed him with reason, evolution, and science. The Superman theory describes a superior version of man. The Superman is a god in human form and parallel to Jesus. In order to create this Ubermensch, he based him on what he thought an evolved human would be like. Henry Bergson said that rational and scientific thought was practical but could not explain reality. He said reality was a life force that covered all things and could not be divided. Collective reality versus individual reality describes how we see things in different ways. Once you describe an experience to someone else, it just becomes a story. Herbert Spencer said societies were organisms that evolved through struggle with the environment. In a struggle for survival, the fit advance while the weak decline. He said the harshness of life still has benefits, and that the state should not intervene in the natural process. Tolstoy wrote War and Peace about Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. It realistically portrays military life and the characters are analyzed psychologically. There is use of realism. It's a fatalistic view of history versus the enduring values of human love and trust. Picasso was a post-impressionist artist who painted in a variety of styles. He used cubism, which was basically geometric designs, as visual stimuli to recreate reality. Les Desmodels d'Avignon was his first cubist painting. Van Gogh was another famous post-impressionist. Post-impressionism retains impressionist emphasis on light and color, but pays more attention to structure and form. He used color and lines to express his inner feelings and make personal statements of reality. He withdrew from the task of drawing the external world, which is the beginning of modern art. Van Gogh's art was a spiritual experience. He believed color could act as its own language. Example, Starry Night. He said artists should paint what they feel. Impressionists painted nature directly from the countryside and rejected the Salon idea of perfection in art. They sought originality and focused on bright colors, dynamic brushstrokes, and the changing effects of light on objects in nature. Impressionist art reflected pastimes of the upper middle class. Monet was a famous impressionist. He focused on the interplay of light, water, and atmosphere. His famous painting is Impression, Sunrise, and it's the artwork that gave Impressionists their name.
Possibly the single most pondered question in history. What caused the unbound, senseless slaughter that was the First World War? It wasn't, like in World War II, a case of a single belligerent pushing others to take a military stand. It didn't have the moral vindication of resisting a tyrant. Rather, a delicate but toxic balance of structural forces created a dry tinder that was lit by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. That event precipitated the July Crisis, which saw the major European powers hurtle toward open conflict. The MAIN acronym is often used to analyze the war. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. It's simplistic, but provides a useful framework. The late 19th century was an era of military competition, particularly between the major European powers. The policy of building a stronger military was judged relative to neighbours, creating a culture of paranoia that heightened the search for alliances. It was fed by the cultural belief that war is good for nations. Germany in particular looked to expand its navy. However, the naval race was never a real contest. The British always maintained naval superiority. But the British obsession with naval dominance was strong. Government rhetoric exaggerated military expansionism. A simple naivety in the potential scale and bloodshed of a European war prevented several governments from checking their aggression. A web of alliances developed in Europe between 1870 and 1914. Effectively creating two camps bound by commitments to maintain sovereignty or intervene militarily. The Triple Alliance of 1882 linked Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. The Triple Entente of 1907 linked France, Britain and Russia. A historic point of conflict between Austria-Hungary and Russia was over their incompatible Balkan interests, and France had a deep suspicion of Germany, rooted in their defeat in the 1870 war. The alliance system primarily came about because after 1870, Germany, under Bismarck, set a precedent by playing its neighbours' imperial endeavours off one another in order to maintain a balance of power within Europe. Imperial competition also pushed the countries towards adopting alliances. Colonies were units of exchange that could be bargained without significantly affecting the metropole. They also brought nations who would otherwise not interact into conflict and agreement. For example, the Russo-Japanese War, 1905, over aspirations in China helped bring the Triple Entente into being. It has been suggested that Germany was motivated by imperial ambitions to invade Belgium and France. Certainly the expansion of the British and French empires, fired by the rise of industrialism and the pursuit of new markets, caused some resentment in Germany, and the pursuit of a short, aborted imperial policy in the late 19th century. However, the suggestion that Germany wanted to create a European empire in 1914 is not supported by the pre-war rhetoric and strategy. Nationalism was also a new and powerful source of tension in Europe. It was tied to militarism and clashed with the interests of the imperial powers in Europe. Nationalism created new areas of interest over which nations could compete. For example, the Habsburg Empire was a tottering agglomeration of 11 different nationalities, with large Slavic populations in Galicia and the Balkans, whose nationalist aspirations ran counter to imperial cohesion. Nationalism in the Balkans also piqued Russia's historic interest in the region. Indeed, Serbian nationalism created the trigger cause of the conflict, the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Ferdinand and his wife were murdered in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Bosnian Serbian nationalist terrorist organization, the Black Hand Gang. Ferdinand's death, which was interpreted as a product of official Serbian policy, created the July Crisis, a month of diplomatic and governmental miscalculations that saw a domino effect of war declarations initiated. The historical dialogue on this issue is vast and distorted by substantial biases. Vague and undefined schemes of reckless expansion were imputed to the German leadership in the immediate aftermath of the war, with the War Guilt Clause. The notion that Germany was bursting with newfound strength, proud of her abilities and eager to showcase them, was overplayed. The almost laughable rationalization of British imperial power as necessary or civilizing didn't translate to German imperialism, which was aggressive and expansionist. There is an ongoing historical discussion on who, if anyone, was most culpable. Blame has been directed at every single combatant at one point or another, and some have said that all the major governments considered it a golden opportunity for increasing popularity at home. The Schlieffen Plan could be blamed for bringing Britain into the war. The scale of the war could be blamed on Russia as the first big country to mobilize. Inherent rivalries between imperialism and capitalism could be blamed for polarizing the combatants. Every point has some merit, but in the end, what proved most devastating was the combination of an alliance network with the widespread, misguided belief that war is good for nations, and that the best way to fight a modern war was to attack. That the war was inevitable is questionable, but certainly the notion of glorious war, of war as good for nation building, was strong pre-1914. By the end of the war, it was dead.
The battles of the frontiers in 1914 took place on the French-German border in Alsace-Lorraine and the French-Belgian border in northeastern France. As the Germans moved west under the Schlieffen Plan, they met with Belgian and French troops. The French army mobilized and advanced eastwards and northwards to meet the German threat. This resulted in 4 battles. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 was a 10-month battle between France and Germany. The Germans wanted to take the Western Front. France, realizing it would not defeat the highly industrialized Germans, built a line of forts from the Swiss frontier to the French city of Verdun. Germans under General Erich von Falkenhayn attacked on February 1916 by bombing the forts with artillery and pounding through the French line. He wanted to bleed the French white by killing as many of them as he could. The French commander-in-chief put General Henri-Philippe Pétain in command and fought with the motto, "They shall not pass." Although several French forts fell in 1916, Verdun was unharmed. With the help of the Allies, the French held their position and no side really won. 540,000 Frenchmen died and 430,000 Germans died, with no gains in anything. It was the longest battle in the war, and considered one of the most brutal events of World War I. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 was a joint offensive carried out by the French under General Joffre and British under General Haig. On July 1, 1916, the British Army attempted a big push across the River Somme to break through the German defenses. The High Command ordered troops to keep uniformed lines and march with the enemy across no man's land. They failed to destroy German military wire and missed the main machine gun post, which led to one of the biggest slaughters in military history. The Germans dragged themselves out of their trenches and mowed down the incoming British soldiers. The British lost over 58,000 men in one day. It was the largest loss in a single day in the history of the British Army. This was the first use of tanks in combat, and the Germans won.
In the summer of 2015, Europe experienced the highest influx of refugees since the Second World War. Why? The main reason is that Syria has become the world's top source of refugees. Syria is located in the Middle East, an ancient, fertile land settled for at least 10,000 years. Since the 1960s, it's been led by the al-Assad family, who have ruled it as quasi-dictators until the Arab Spring happened in 2011, a revolutionary wave of protests and conflicts in the Arab world that toppled many authoritarian regimes. But the Assads refused to step down and started a brutal civil war. Different ethnicities and religious groups fought each other in changing coalitions. ISIS, a militaristic jihadist group, used the opportunity and entered the chaos with the goal to build a totalitarian Islamic caliphate. Very quickly, it became one of the most violent and successful extremist organizations on earth. All sides committed horrible war crimes using chemical weapons, mass executions, torture on a large scale, and repeated deadly attacks on civilians. The Syrian population was trapped between the regime, rebel groups, and the religious extremists. A third of the Syrian people have been displaced within Syria, while over 4 million have fled the country. The vast majority of them reside now in camps in the neighboring countries, who are taking care of 95% of the refugees, while the Arab states of the Persian Gulf together have accepted 0 Syrian refugees, which has been called especially shameful by Amnesty International. The UN and the World Food Programme were not prepared for a refugee crisis on this scale. As a result, many refugee camps are crowded and undersupplied, subjecting people to cold, hunger, and disease. The Syrians lost hope that their situation will be getting better anytime soon, so many decided to seek asylum in Europe. Between 2007 and 2014, the European Union had invested about €2 billion into fences, high-tech security technology and border patrols, but not a lot in preparation for an influx of refugees. So it was badly prepared for the storm of asylum seekers. In the EU, a refugee has to stay in the state they arrived in first, which put enormous pressure on the border states that were already in trouble. Greece, in the midst of an economic crisis on the scale of the Great Depression, was not able to take care of so many people at once, leading to terrible scenes of desperate, hungry people on islands usually reserved for tourists. The world needed to come together and act as a united front, but instead it has become more divided. Many states downright refused to take in any refugees, leaving the border states alone in their struggle. In 2014, the UK lobbied to stop a huge search and rescue operation called Mare Nostrum that was designed to stop asylum seekers from drowning in the Mediterranean. The idea seems to have been that a higher death toll on the sea would mean fewer asylum seekers trying to make the journey. But of course, in reality, that's not what happened. The perception of the crisis around the world suddenly changed when photos circulated of a dead boy from Syria found lying face down on a beach in Turkey. Germany announced that it will, without exception, accept all Syrian refugees and is now preparing to take in 800,000 people in 2015. More than the entire EU took in 2014, only to impose temporary border controls a few days later and demand an EU-wide solution. All over the West, more and more people are beginning to take action, although support for asylum seekers has mostly come from citizens, not from politicians. But there are fears in the Western world: Islam, high birth rates, crime and the collapse of the social systems. Let's acknowledge this and look at the facts. Even if the EU alone were to accept all 4 million Syrian refugees and 100% of them were Muslims, the percentage of Muslims in the European Union would only rise from about 4% to about 5%. This is not a drastic change and will certainly not make it a Muslim continent. A Muslim minority is neither new nor reason to be afraid. Birth rates in many parts of the Western world are low, so some fear asylum seekers might overtake the native population in a few decades. Studies have shown that even though birth rates are higher among Muslims in Europe, they drop and adjust as the standard of living and level of education rises. Most Syrian refugees already are educated. The birth rate in Syria before the civil war was not very high, and the population was actually shrinking, not growing. The fear that refugees lead to higher crime rates also turns out to be wrong. Refugees who become immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than the native population. When allowed to work, they tend to start businesses and integrate themselves into the workforce as fast as possible, paying more into the social systems than they extract from them. Syrians coming to the West are potential professional workers, desperately needed to sustain Europe's aging population. Also, refugees traveling with smartphones has led to the misconception that they're not really in need of help. Social media and the internet have become a vital part of being a refugee. GPS is used to navigate the long routes to Europe. Facebook groups give tips and information about obstacles in real time. This only proves that these people are like us. If you had to make a dangerous journey, would you leave your phone behind? The European Union is the wealthiest bunch of economies on Earth, well-organized states with functioning social systems, infrastructure, democracy, and huge industries. It can handle the challenge of the refugee crisis if it wants to. The same can be said for the whole Western world. But while tiny Jordan has taken in over 600,000 Syrian refugees, the UK, which has 78 times the GDP of Jordan, has only said it will allow 20,000 Syrians across its borders over the next 5 years. The US has agreed to accept 10,000, Australia 12,000 people. Overall, things are slowly getting better, but not fast enough. We are writing history right now. How do we want to be remembered? As xenophobic rich cowards behind fences? We have to realize that these people fleeing death and destruction are no different from us. By accepting them into our countries and integrating them into our societies, we have much to gain. There is only something to be lost if we ignore this crisis. More dead children are sure to wash ashore if we don't act with humanity and reason. Let's do this right and try to be the best we possibly can be.